Hello, today I'm going to talk about my first novel called The Invisible Histories of the Spiral Mountain. This is going to be a long video, probably, because this book is sort of the culmination of about at least 10 years of work, and there's a lot that got me to the point of making the novel. So I'm going to discuss each sort of little part and maybe give you my thoughts on how I see it now. I'm going to begin the video by reading the synopsis to you. After a series of unfortunate events, a broken man searches for meaning in one of America's most dangerous cities, Detroit, Michigan. His life changes when he exits the bourgeois and meets an enigmatic figure, a teacher who initiates him into a secret brotherhood of knights, where overcoming fear, challenging sexual taboo, and facing death become the prime directives. Through this metamorphosis, two worlds collide. A fantasy realm conquers waking life as the transformative experience reveals the mystical principles taught by the Rosicrucians, a society of Kabbalistic warriors whose esoteric doctrine provides insight into spiritual realms. Soon after, the man finds illumination in a young woman's loving embrace. Every knight must have his maiden, a muse held in the highest regard. Experiencing the unobtainable virgin's tenderness becomes the crux of the knight errant's struggle with courtly love. This doomed romance changes the knight forever. Alright, so, man, this is a big one to tackle. So, I guess first I will talk about the sort of seeds of how this story came to be. It basically started in Detroit. I was living there, and I detail a lot of this in the actual story. It was a pivotal time for me. That time, sort of in your mid-20s, where you're sort of taking on who you will become as an adult. And in some ways, this book is a coming-of-age story, although coming-of-age stories usually typically take place when someone is in their late teens. So I would say the main difference is that this is a coming-of-age story being initiated into magic. So technically, I was already an adult, but as someone that was interested in magic, this was an experience that opened up a lot of doors. And I would say that the main focus of the book is sort of the process of individuation or initiation. It really started with a love affair. There were two things. There was a love affair, and there was a mystical teacher that I met. And these things kind of happened at the same time. And, you know, it was a very chaotic time, and the book has a lot of this chaos in it. So it's not for the faint of heart, I would say. It's pretty messy, especially compared to my later novels. But essentially, I wrote a couple of these sort of mystical allegories, these fables. I wrote like 3 of them, I think. And they were sort of based off these experiences that I couldn't really, at the time, I couldn't articulate them with sort of a traditional story. So as I started writing these fables, I realized that they were sort of this mythology, and I made one of them called The Hatchlings into a book of its own, a handmade book. And this sort of prompted me to see that they were part of one thing. And eventually I realized that I needed to make this into something larger. And I didn't really have the skills at the time to do that, so I had to move from Detroit, which was probably a good thing, because if you read the book, you'll realize that a lot of my experiences there, especially in the inner city, were quite reckless and dangerous. And if I had stayed there, I probably wouldn't be alive today. So anyway, I moved to Portland, Oregon to attend a craft school there to learn how to make books so I could make this book. And it was very frustrating because I didn't really know what this was, but then I had to go through all these really basic classes to try to get up to the point where I could make this thing that I had been thinking about for a long time. And so the first sort of 2 years of school was just exercises about learning how to make a book, and very little about actually getting to the point where I could make this. In my third year, I took a writing class, and the instructor, he really had a profound impact on me, primarily because he really encouraged me to dig into this and to figure out who I was. And some of this was through his assignments. So what ended up happening is I wrote several, like he would give us these assignments that were like, tell about a profound, experience in your life, sort of these writing prompts. And eventually, some of these writing prompts ended up becoming parts of the book, and I didn't even realize. So I detailed these different experiences in a more, almost like a beat writer type voice, which was, semi-autobiographical. At some moments, in some moments, more than in others, but I came up with that kind of narrative, and it was very separate from the mystical allegories that I initially started with. So for a while I didn't realize that these two things were part of the same creation. And I got to my thesis year, the fourth year of school, and I knew what I wanted to do. I mean, a lot of people at my school were struggling, trying to figure out what they wanted to do, but I had the whole thing. I didn't have it mapped out, but I knew what it needed to be, and I knew what I had to learn to get it done. So I really jumped into it, and as I jumped into it, it grew to be larger and larger, and a little bit, it got a little bit out of hand, especially for the amount of time that I had to finish it. So I was working pretty much non-stop. But what I ended up doing is writing more and more in both voices, and I realized that the book was going to be these two different voices. One, a sort of narrative, like a straightforward narrative, and then the other, a almost like a fable or fairy tale type mythical allegory. And the stuff that was in that voice was more how you see the world after you've gone through an initiation. The narrative part turned out to be sort of the anchor, and that kind of leads you through the story, but then the allegorical part is more a sort of rumination on these ideas that are very hard to articulate and sort of spoken in almost its own language, I guess. So eventually I produced this handmade edition of this book, which was actually 4 volumes, and they had wood covers, and I printed them on a computer printer, an archival computer printer, designed the whole inside and everything. And as it got completed, I realized that I needed it to be, after I figured out what it was, I realized that there needed to be a print edition as well. So in the last few months of my thesis, I had to also make this, which was more stress and a lot to take on, but I realized that they had to be, I guess I just wanted more people to read it, and if it was in the gallery, you know, you really can't sit down and read inside a gallery. So I ended up making the print version, and I wouldn't say it was rushed, but it was definitely not perfect. So a year or two later, I ended up doing a second edition to try to clean it up and get it to a better state. So on a deep level, I would say it illustrates the messiness of a spiritual awakening. So if you've ever gone through one, you know that it's not a pleasant experience, and usually it's like the dark night of the soul, or this real challenging time. So the first half of the book basically deals with that and this blossoming sort of love affair, and then there's sort of this shift where it becomes more of a treatise on magic and struggling with the insights that you get from something like an experience like that. And I think that, you know, some of the themes that I touch upon in it are like creation and destruction, and how like the two things are tied. And I mean, one of the main symbols of the book is the ruined city, which is Detroit, which is a very destroyed place, but there is magic there because of the creativity needed to be in a place like that. So I was very fascinated with how these two opposites would inform each other, which sort of led into this alchemical language. You know, in alchemy they talk a lot about the opposites and the polarities. So I will do another video about alchemy at a later date. But that was a prime centerpiece of this book, and with it I sort of got into these ideas of conundrum and puzzles. So there's a lot of, I mean, if you really get deeply into the book and you have any kind of like occult knowledge, it has multiple levels of reading, I guess. On the surface, someone that has no occult knowledge could just read this book as a story, and I think it still works. But if you have occult knowledge, I think you can get a lot more out of it. And, you know, some of the puzzles were also me sort of figuring them out as I was writing. So, like, even for me, it was a learning experience. There were mystical questions that I needed answered, and by writing this, it helped me do that. And, you know, I think that the book, it was my first book, so I think anyone's first book is very influenced by other people, and that's definitely the case in this book. So I thought for a second I would tell you some of the influences, just to kind of give you an idea of what or where this came from. So one of the prime influences would be Henry Miller's The Tropic of Cancer. He greatly influenced the beat writers, and I read that book right when I was in the middle of this destructive time, and that's really what the book is about, is sort of destroying your past life, the life that you had, and rebuilding yourself into something else. So that book was very important. Another one was Her by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, a beat writer. And the idea in that book is more like about the feminine as this archetype almost, and that bled into what I was doing a lot. So I think that was pretty important for it. Another one similar that was similar to that was The Girl with the Golden Eyes by Balzac. And a little bit later, when I was actually creating the book, Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities had a huge impact on it. Obviously, the title of mine is similar. I don't really talk about the cities the way that he does, but the idea of this sort of mystical city had a big influence on this. So as far as the love story part, I think the main thing that influenced this would be Lolita by Nabokov, and not for the reasons that one might think. This woman that I was in love with gave me this book, and it obviously, there's the protagonist is kind of a nasty person, I guess. And I don't think I really identified with him, but I do the idea of sort of like forbidden love and what you would do if you're in that situation, I think is interesting. And also the idea that he's kind of destroyed by it at the same time, I think is important. With that in mind, I also was very influenced by the works of Georges Bataille, because his work is mainly about the transgression of taboo, and that is basically what happened when I fell in love with this person. So and there were a lot of other experiences in that time in Detroit that I was trying to transgress taboo, to learn. So his work really, really resonated with me. And of course, since there's a lot of mythology in this, Joseph Campbell's books both had a lot to do with it. As far as the initiation aspect, I would say Hermann Hesse's Demian and Steppenwolf both played a part, and Kerouac's Dharma Bums and the Subterraneans, they're both in there too. In terms of the writing process, one of the most important things for me, I think, was the work of William Burroughs and Brian Geisen with their cut-ups, because I used this technique quite a bit to generate a lot of my ideas, not just in the writing by moving things around, but also by creating the collages which I illustrated for the book. So sometimes I would create the collages with that technique in mind, the cut-up, which is a magical technique that they, I don't think they discovered it, but they sort of made it popular. So I would make these collages, and I didn't even know what they were. And often parts of the book were written based off these collages. So it was kind of like a synergy. I mean, normally a book is written and then the illustrations are sort of done separately, but in this case they were informing each other. So really there was sort of three voices. There was the narrative voice, the mythical, mythical allegory voice, and then this sort of illustrative voice. And I think the merging of those things was inspired by sort of two main things, and one would be Nietzsche's work, particularly Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil. Those two books had a lot to do with this. And on the other side would be Stephen King's The Dark Tower. At the time that I wrote this, it wasn't complete yet, so I think they were up to book 4 maybe when I started writing this. But over the course of my thesis, near the end, he actually finished it. So that was something, a presence that was really there at the end of my thesis. And of course, a lot of the book has to do with the Night Errand image and Arthurian legend and chivalry. So that really informed the I'm not really sure how to put it, actually. I mean, it's a type of magical realism, I guess, and sort of a almost, I mean, I guess the book has this sort of mythical wasteland kind of aspect to it, which is something that is similar to the Dark Tower. Obviously, it's my own mythical wasteland that's in my head, but it's definitely, the DNA is there. So there are many ideas that have to do with alchemy, and I structured the book into 7 parts because there's 7 stages of alchemy, and I really felt it on a tangible level when I was experiencing all this. So the first part is called The Dead Man, and that was sort of this time before I moved to downtown Detroit, when I was in the suburbs of the Detroit area, and it was kind of like the name suggests, sort of a dead time where my heart was not alive, I guess. I was sort of going through the motions and living life like most people do, I guess, or some people. And I had a sort of break in that, which I detail in the book, but then came The Living Man, which was sort of like the fiery calcination part of the process, and that was me moving into downtown Detroit and struggling with that experience and the fire of that experience. And so the third part is called The Eternal Man, and that was more of living with the insights that I gained from the 2 first phases and trying to merge that into real life, because it's really hard to, once you've sort of broken that mold, it's really hard to come back to reality, I guess. So that part is more of an assessment of how you do that in yourself, which leads to the 4th part, which is a very internal section, and it's the most abstract, I think, of the book, because it's almost all visions. That's called The Child, and it's very sort of crude and messy and dark, and it's almost like the subconscious underneath the whole thing. And then sort of sublimating that in the 5th part, it is called The Night Errand, and in the book, the character sort of takes on this burden that you kind of get from doing these things and tries to use it for something, but often stumbles because, you know, it takes a long time to understand these kind of truths, and sometimes when you gain an insight like this, you think you know how it works and you think you know everything about it, and then you realize you don't. And then the 6th part is called The Magician. So the Knight Errant sort of stumbles and then transforms into the magician. And like I said earlier, the mythical voice sort of gets greater and greater as the book goes on. And in the last chapter, it's called The Ruined City, or The Spiral Mountain. you sort of understand what everything was sort of working towards, and there's, I guess, I mean, you'd call it a conclusion, but it's more a spiritual calm, I guess, at the end. That's not really a spoiler, but if you ever read it, you'll understand what I mean by that. So to wrap this up, I think I'm just going to give you a little bit about how I feel about this book now. It's been, it's been a long time since I've written it. I published it the first time in 2009, so it's been quite a while. And it's a really hard book to pin down for me because obviously it's my first novel, so there's a soft spot in that regard, but it is a bit of a mess, in my opinion. Not because the ideas aren't good or the not that there's not truth in it, but I didn't really know how to write a book at the time. So I suppose if I had written it now, it would be more concise and more articulate and more efficient in how I told the story. But part of me actually is okay with that. It's definitely a representation of who I was at the time and these sort of things that I struggled with. And, you know, I think it's, on one hand, you know, many people might not like it because it's a bit dark at times and there's some taboo things in it. But I also think that there's a very sort of tragic and beautiful love story in there. And, you know, if you can kind of get past all the other things, that is maybe the strongest part of it. I almost see it as, I mean, you know, people say therapy. I would not say it's therapy. I would say it's more a process of trying to understand who I needed to be in order to write it, which isn't usually the way that someone approaches a novel. So in that regard, it might be a bit unique. And, you know, maybe that is its fault also because it sort of meanders because I didn't know where it was going at the time I was writing it either. You know, usually someone will plot out a plot and, you know, make it very tight. In this case, this kind of book is not. It's almost more of like these sort of struggles against myself and my ego and trying to sort of sublimate these negative tendencies in me into something positive. So in that regard, my newer work, I think, especially my last novel, Dominique's Confession, is better. It has a lot of the same ideas, but it's definitely more concise and more focused. And I definitely knew what I was doing when I was writing it. But I don't know. I think there's an innocence in this book that I probably never have again in anything else I write. So in that regard, I feel proud of it. I think that's about it. Anyway, I just want to say one more thing. There were a lot of people that influenced me during this time. And I guess when you're going through life, that's like part of the ride, right? And sometimes you hurt people, sometimes they hurt you, and you kind of have to sort through those things to understand like why those events happened. And I guess in a way this is sort of me sorting through some of the more pivotal moments in my life with some of the most pivotal people in my life. So I guess I just want to say thank you to those people, because I loved all of them, and some of them I don't talk to anymore, or we've lost touch, or some of them I still talk to, but they all had a really important contribution to this book. So thank you, and that's about it. I'll talk to you later.